Suppose that, for whatever reason, investment increases by £100. Somewhere a business firm hires extra workers to the tune of £100. According to Keynes's consumption function, our workers will spend 3/4 of the extra £100 of income, or £75, on consumption, and they will save the rest. But the effect doesn't stop there. We now introduce Keynes's concept of the multiplier, namely that any increase in investment will have a multiplied effect on income. If our workers spend the £75 of their extra £100 to buy groceries, the grocers spend 3/4 of the £75 they receive on food for themselves and on new orders from their wholesalers. And these wholesalers, in turn, spend 3/4 of their extra income, leading to an ever-dwindling series of consumption, spending, and respending. The amazing thing is that this dwindling series does not go on forever. It adds up to a very definite number. If the workers spend 3/4 on consumption, the multiplier is 4. If they'd spend 4/5, the multiplier would have been 5. If they'd spent 7/8, the multiplier would have been 8. In other words, the greater the fraction of extra income spent on consumption respending, the greater is the multiplier effect of new private investment. The whole argument works just as well on public investment, say on money spent by governments on public work programs. What Keynes is saying is that the value of the multiplier is always greater than 1. And if this is so, it must be true that any amount of unemployment can be cured, at least in principle, by a sufficiently large increase in public spending, whatever the source of that spending. I wonder if you realize how extraordinary this is. Economists have been debating the pros and cons of public works in depressions for over a century without coming to any definite conclusion. We've just spent 5 minutes expounding the simplified Keynesian theory of income determination. And we've shown, I hope conclusively, that a given amount of private or public spending is capable of raising national income by at least as much, and perhaps by even more, and in this way can eliminate any amount of unemployment. That is the central message that Keynes brought to economics. I went to Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, and spoke to Professor James Tobin, whose work in the Keynesian spirit earned him a Nobel Prize in economics. Keynes's general theory was practically the first book that he'd ever read in economics.
Why did it make such an impression on a 19-year-old in 1936? Well, because anybody who was alert to world problems was distressed by the economic and political problems of the day and the apparent inability of anybody to do anything about them. And along came a book that logically said what to do, what could be done. It wasn't hopeless. And it also said so in a way that was exciting to a student who was mathematically, theoretically, quantitatively inclined. And you like theoretical controversy when you're that age, and you like the good guys and the bad guys, and you side with the forces of new thought against the encrusted orthodoxy. And I didn't know much about the encrusted orthodoxy, but it appealed to me that I could join the revolt against it.
At MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, there's another Nobel Prize winner, Professor Paul Samuelson. His textbook, Economics, was almost the first post-war textbook to introduce Keynesian economics to first-year students.
I was still 20 when the general theory came out, but I had a very early education. I was precocious, and I was at the University of Chicago, the inner temple of classical economics. So unlike my friend Jim Tobin, who always says that he didn't know any better but to be a Keynesian because he started just after Keynes arrived, I know what it was like before, and I know what it was like after, and it was because the old theory had no handle at all to explain what was happening in London, in New York, Main Street, Iowa, in the years 1930 to 1936, that there was a tremendous opening here, and it was Keynes who magnificently made a beginning in filling that opening.
Keynes's theorizing has not always impressed everyone. One economist has said that Keynes had a poet's intuition and a practical man's grasp, but that he did not know how to theorize rigorously, an astonishing thing to say about a great thinker. The man who said that was Frank Hahn, now professor at Keynes's old university, Cambridge.
That he was not rigorous in his theorizing is simply a consequence of the fact that I think he wasn't too much interested in economic theory. His teacher was Marshall, and Marshall was the man who, as it were, produced the dominant theory of the market economy, not only for England but for the Western world of that period. He's codified, a great deal had gone before, but he was a dominant influence. Keynes never liberated himself from what he had learned from Marshall, and yet what he had to say in the book was plain opposite to what Marshall had to say. And that is why the book, when it appeared, was reviewed in a very hostile manner by Pigou.
There's no disagreement that Keynes had an enormous impact on economic theory, on economic policy, and on the general climate of social and political thought following World War II. But there is disagreement on precisely what he meant to say in the general theory.
The central message of the general theory is pretty clear, I think. It's given in the first part of the general theory. It is that you can't rely on the free market to maintain full employment equilibrium. The self-recuperative or the self-adjusting features of the system are too weak to do that. And contrary to the neoclassical belief that any time a market's out of balance, then price movements will put it back into equality of supply and demand. Keynes comes along and says that may be true of the fish market or the market for rice or something, but it's not true of the national or international market for goods and services in total or for labor.
The central message was that he took the level of unemployment and the level of aggregate output as a variable to be explained, whereas the schoolman who taught me really had a theory that the only unemployment possible was a zero rate of unemployment, because a classical system can always find its equilibrium where everybody who really wants a job will be able to find one.
On Easter Saturday in 1946, Keynes drove to one of his favorite places, high on the Sussex Downs overlooking his country home at Tilton. In a fit of energy, he chose to walk down. The next day, he died. The impact which Keynes had on economics with his general theory is what is known as the Keynesian revolution in economic thought. Never before or since has the economics profession been converted so quickly and so massively to a new economic theory. Within the space of a decade, 1936 to 46, the vast majority of economists in the Western world were won over to the Keynesian way of thinking. During the last years of his life, he spread his influence from his academic colleagues through the corridors of power in Whitehall. During World War II, he re-entered the British Treasury as a semi-official, as he put it. The first British budget to be constructed on Keynesian lines emerged in 1941, prepared in part by two young Keynesians, James Meade and Richard Stone, who were later to become Nobel Prize laureates for this and other work. Keynes had created an entirely new field of economic inquiry, macroeconomics, concerned with the determination of income, output, and employment in the economy as a whole. Keynes influenced not only economic theory, but also economic statistics, and thus tied in neatly with the quantitative revolution in the practice of economic science that went on at the same time as the Keynesian revolution. He had also been working to establish a new system of international monetary relations, and played a highly significant role in the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 that produced the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank.
Representatives of 28 countries, with Lord Halifax signing for the United Kingdom, meet in the conference room of Washington's State Department for the signing of the Bretton Woods Monetary Agreement. Authorized by President Truman to sign...
In short, he helped to create the framework of international monetary relations for most of the next 3 decades, even though he never lived to see that international order. But of course it was in the running of domestic economic policy that Keynes was to make his greatest impact. This period of economic policy conducted on Keynesian lines is often referred to as the age of Keynes. But did it achieve as much as was once thought? Keynes had argued in the context of the appalling unemployment rates of the 1930s for a once-and-for-all boost to aggregate demand via public works. He didn't worry too much about the effect this might have on inflation once full employment was achieved. But Friedrich Hayek recalls that Keynes realized that post-war conditions might be different.
The very last time I saw him, about 6 weeks before his death, I was meeting him, I was still having dining rights at King's College, and I was here for a weekend, and talked to him after dinner and asked him whether he wasn't alarmed for what his pupils, naming two, I won't name now, were doing, agitating for more expansion, when in fact the danger clearly was inflation. He completely agreed with me and assured me my theory was frightfully important in the 1930s was a question of combating deflation. Trust me, if inflation ever becomes a danger, I'm going to turn public opinion around like this. 6 weeks he was dead, later he was dead and couldn't do it.
After he was gone, his Cambridge disciples, such as Richard Kahn, Joan Robinson, and Nicholas Caldor, argued that Keynesian demand management would allow the achievement of rates of unemployment as low as 1% without a threat to price stability. But would Keynes himself have agreed to targets so low?
As far as Keynes was concerned, the target rate seems to have, to some extent, changed with the circumstances. In that 1937, 38, when one is in the early stages of rearmament, Keynes, with unemployment at 12%, is arguing in favor of a better distribution of any increases in aggregate demand. At least any increases in aggregate government expenditure should be, to some extent, distributed regionally towards areas of high unemployment rather than just, as it were, pumped into the system. On the other hand, by the time you get to 1943, 1944, there is a belief that post-war levels of employment will probably be 5% or lower, although he wouldn't go as low as Beveridge's 3%. He didn't think that was possible. So that to some extent what the target would have been, if there had been a target, probably would have been elastic, depending on one's experience of running the system. On the other hand, there would have been this continuing concern with stability of the price level, or at least relative stability of the price level.
The age of Keynes forged a link between Beveridge's idea of the welfare state and the Keynesian idea of demand management to make up what was in Britain called lib-lab socialism, and in America went under the label of progressive liberalism. But was Keynes himself really a welfarist?